So we're doing the interview, of course, in English, and the questions are in English. And so the responses are going to be translated to English. So I think just to make a quick footnote here that the descriptors that I'm going to use in English have some kind of a Quechua philosophy behind them. So they should not be taken just as a straightforward translation. So 3 words to describe Quechua and Andean communities. Well, one, as another footnote very quickly, is that Andean and Quechua communities, I wouldn't say are synonymous. So there are Quechua communities in the Andes. There are also Quechua communities in the selva, in the jungle regions. So by nature of living in the Andes, should not be presumed that there are only Quechua communities there. There are dominantly Quechua people across the Andes, but there's also, of course, a diversity of different populations in Peru. So we have, descendants of Europeans, we have Afro-Peruvians. So there is diversity, although at times different groups tend to be situated in different parts of the country more predominantly. So if I were to use 3 words to describe Quechua communities, because that's where my family is, that's where my heart is, that's where my work is, I would describe Quechua communities as incredibly strong. And this is coming from the term calpa in Quechua. So like calpayo means strength. So you can be physically strong, but you're also emotionally strong. You're also spiritually strong. And that kind of strength speaks to not in the Western conceptualization of how we might consider the strongest person to be the most dominant person, or the most, the one who's positioned to be the leader, but rather that there is an appreciation in the Quechua language and in Quechua ways of living of being strong in multiple ways. So you can be strong emotionally, you can be strong spiritually, physically, and with that strength comes a sense of resilience. Because when you're confronted with different things that would ordinarily crush you, you have the power, you have the will, you have the life force within you to be able to endure. So strength is one way of describing Quechua communities. I would view them as incredibly strong. I think it's also important to note that Quechua communities are very strong because oftentimes there's a global stigmatization as well as a national view in Peru and other Latin American countries that Indigenous peoples are victims and inferior and weak. And that victim assignment is really problematic when it comes to anyone, any human, really any living being. That victim assignment is something that limits our understanding of that other being, and of their capacity to be strong, of their capacity to endure, of their capacity to be resilient, and of their capacity to actually not only be strong, but to also be generative, to give. So strength is one way of describing the communities. I would also describe our communities as beautiful. So beautiful, not just, again, using the Western terms or just drawing strictly from European etymologies, but beautiful in the way that we might describe tuquilla in the Quechua language. Beautiful meaning not just outwardly, the physical landscape or the physical character, the characteristics of a person, but beautiful meaning the embodiment of the ability to be generous, the embodiment of the ability to give, the embodiment of the ability to generate as a life-giving force. And our communities, I believe, have incredible heart and incredible love. And they are places where so much has happened across history for the last 480, 500 years, yet where people maintain really intensely rich and beautiful philosophies about how to live in a particular place. And so the character of the communities, the philosophies of the communities, the landscape of the communities, the land itself, these are all very beautiful. They're generative, they're loving, they're giving. And they're also quite astute at recognizing our relationships with the natural world. So Quechua communities as a reflection of the beauty of the natural world, I think has always been the aim of how Quechua people, Runakuna, Nunakuna, depending on the language variety, how Quechua people have always strived to live. The third characteristic or the third descriptor that I would use for our communities is brilliant and intellectual. So brilliant, really meaning intellectual. And this comes from the Quechua term like umayo, which I think is really important to note given the fact that we live in Peru in a very unequal society. So we live in a society that is incredibly racist and classist, a society that likes to tout its diversity, cultural diversity, ethnic diversity, even linguistic diversity, but actually does everything in its power at the state level in order to subjugate indigeneity, to say that, well, Quechua culture, it's pretty, it's colorful, but Quechua people, you know, those who are working in the farm fields, those who are collecting the herbs from the mountains, those who are herding the alpacas, they're not necessarily capable, or they're not necessarily intellectual. And I think that that's really problematic, because the root, really the roots of Quechua communities is intense brilliance. Quechua people are incredibly smart. They have lived for millennia, thousands and thousands of years in the places where they live, and they have done so paying attention to the natural cycles of the environment, as well as the unnatural changes that have shifted the environment. And they have very strong explanations for why the world looks the way it does, why certain characteristics within nature appear, why there are certain phenomena. And it is incredibly intellectual, and it is incredibly brilliant to be able to survive and thrive in these environments, in these places, in these homelands. And so we see this, we see that Quechua communities embody intellectualism and they embody brilliance. It may not look the way that it does in the West, so it might not be something that mimics European Enlightenment, but I think it's really important to decenter Europeanization, and really important to decenter Western conceptualizations of intellectualism and brilliance and smartness. I think it's really important to understand that there are lots of different ways that people see themselves as contributing to the world, and that too is intellectualism. So those are my three descriptors. I view our communities as strong, I view them as beautiful, and I view them as brilliant. It's important to note that Indigenous knowledge is not a singular term. So we really want to expand that to call it Indigenous knowledges, because lots of different Indigenous communities have knowledges that they've cultivated over time. With Quechua communities as well, just because we might speak the same language or come from the same language family, we also have very different local flavorings regarding how we understand that very term. So some language term that we might use. So in many ways, our communities are also quite heteroglossic and diverse, which I think is really important to note. The second qualifier that I would also place on this is that with Indigenous knowledge, or the notion of Indigenous knowledge is, I also think that it's really important for us to think about not compartmentalizing Indigenous peoples or our communities into kind of like a quote unquote traditional category, even though our own community members will say, you know, in Spanish, they'll say things like, well, that's tradition, you know, or in Quechua, they'll say that's our way, you know, that's our way of doing things. And so when we think about Indigenous knowledge, sometimes, you know, outsiders or people who may not be familiar with Indigenous peoples and communities or Quechua peoples and communities might think of that knowledge as being quite fixed, and that it only speaks to quote unquote ancestral knowledge. But in reality, Indigenous knowledges are incredibly adaptable. You know, just like communities, just like people, they're resilient, they learn, and they adapt. And what I think is really exceptional about Quechua knowledges is that they innovate. So what we think of as ancestral knowledge might actually be a combination of different kinds of knowledge forms, different ways of knowing. So our Quechua communities might be utilizing some, let's say, way of farming or some architectural technique, some way of building structures, you know, that rely on mathematical calculations and ways of reading the world that borrow from, you know, Western ways of knowing, that borrow from other ancient cultures prior to Quechua communities in Peru, as well as some of the religious practices, spiritual practices, and beliefs. So I think really important to note with Indigenous knowledge is, one, diverse, as well as ever-changing, ever-growing, capable of learning and capable of adapting. So we never want to pigeonhole. So when we think about Indigenous knowledges in relation to cultural practices, I believe that it is really important to underscore that knowledges are only as good as they are practiced. Knowledges are only as good as they are shared, as they are taught, as they are debated. And so Quechua communities are no different in that way, in terms of being able to draw from ancestral systems of knowing, but also innovating them. Yet Quechua communities are incredibly distinct. I think it is also very important for us to note that one of the major claims to Indigenous rights worldwide is that we have distinct ways of living, distinct relationships with our governments, meaning the state, distinct understandings of our histories, distinct relationships with our lands and territories, as well as distinct languages. So with Quechua knowledges, for example, and cultural practices, a lot of different people around the world might say, well, I know this thing, I know this piece of information, maybe something has been taught to me. But what I think is really beautiful and brilliant and strong about Quechua communities is that they are able to transform the knowledges into practices in ways that bring together community, that deepen not only our understanding of that knowledge, but our relationship with it. So for example, in my community of Chongos Bajo, there are amazing ceremonies and rituals that are done in order to honor the Apus, the mountains. A rough translation would be that these are mountain deities, but they are like our ancestors, our leaders, our relatives, you know, our kin in many ways. So it's, what I'm trying to say is that the knowledge piece might be, oh, I appreciate this mountain, right? I understand that this mountain is very old, but that knowledge is only as good as how you express it, how you practice it, how you teach it, share it. So, you know, we have across Andean communities, we share this with other Quechua peoples in other places, in other IUs, other communities. We share the belief of how you demonstrate your relationships to the mountains, how you honor the mountains through ceremony. Another piece of Quechua knowledge might be that Quechua people, and, let's say comparing here in the West, in the United States, there's the heavy movement of, which, and rightfully so, of, animal rights, animal advocacy, and so forth. So many people might say, oh, I love animals, I advocate for their rights, I take care of them. And those are so important, it is so important to be politically active in those ways, to be economically supporting of people who do that kind of work. As well, in Quechua communities, there is the knowledge that animals are our relatives, they're part of our family. And so in my community and in other Quechua communities across the highlands, people have distinct songs that they sing for the animals. There's a way of understanding your relationship with more than human beings that is practiced. And it is practiced through family togetherness, community togetherness, and that recognition that ceremonies and rituals are the ways in which you exercise your belief systems, your knowledge systems. So again, I'll just say that my experiences with Quechua communities and in the Highlands region, and I work mainly with communities in the regions of Junin and Cusco, and my family ancestry is Junin, Huancavelica, and Cusco. And so I can really only speak to Quechua peoples in the Andes region. So the concept of the Ayu is really heavily misunderstood. So we know that Ayu has been very roughly, like many indigenous language terms and concepts, particularly across the Andes region with Quechua communities. This also happens in the selva regions of the jungles where, people might take terms and they take them up and they adopt them in ways that are so limited by the English language and so limited by Western scholarly conceptual frameworks. So Ayu has roughly been translated as just community, but there are amazing works by historians who are from Peru, as well as anthropologists who are from Peru, most importantly from community members themselves, describing what it means to live in Ayu. And there are also, over the last 5-10 years, I think there's some increasing excellent scholarship by US-based Peruvian scholars as well, contributing to these ideas. So there really are some amazing descriptions of what is Ayu. Ayu as sort of a living, and I'm not going to pretend to give you a definition, but Ayu is sort of a living, breathing recognition of community as people, space, geography, more than human, and also extending more deeply and profoundly into the worlds of the non-human, so ancestors. And so Ayu is not just people, when we think of people as living beings, because it is more than human relatives, as well as non-human or non-human beings, as well as non-living ancestors. And it's also more than just space. So not within the boundaries of a marked community, especially communities that may have been marked by colonialism, mapped and marked, demarcated by colonialism, but rather community as understood as the expanse of a particular territory. So not just one space, but everything that space touches as well, and the responsibilities and obligations, and the ways in which you understand your relations. So think, if you can, model-wise of Ayu as transcending time, as going very deep, profoundly deeply, as well as expanding outward. And I think that this also is related to the Quechua conceptualizations of the universe for us, the Andean universe. Our understanding of what is what is the connectivity between Kaipacha, Uhupacha, and Hanakpacha. So what are the connectivities between this world, the interior world, and the upper sky world? And Ayu is a place where those kinds of things are enacted. So it is the place of the cultivation of our indigenous knowledges, as well as the place of the cultivation and continuation of our indigenous cultural practices. So Ayu is the place in which those relations are continually reestablished, and it is also the place where those practices are hopefully continually honoring our relationship with Hanakpacha, Kaipacha, and Ohupacha. And when we speak of the ways in which really any functioning community behaves and what characterizes it, Quechua people and Quechua communities are in many ways incredibly pragmatic. So we're not just talking about sort of esoteric, poetic ways of understanding the formation and the continuation of community. That certainly is a part of it, because as we know, Quechua music and poetry, philosophies, adages, all of these things are an incredibly rich part of how Quechua people express their understanding of relationship to each other and their families, their homelands, their communities, and all of the beings in the region. So yes, they are poetic and aesthetic and esoteric as well, but Quechua communities are also incredibly pragmatic. And so when we think about what are the ways in which a community might be structured, how is it designed? Quechua communities have a lot of thought, and it's pulling from that intellectualism as well. They are very intelligently designed. I am not trying to over romanticize our communities, because there have been significant changes as well over time, meaning that there are ways that some of that intelligent design has been disrupted, and we can see evidence of that across Peru. So we can see the ways in which, through colonialism, those in power, in political power, came in and really destroyed a lot of the temples, but the ways in which they utilized the foundations to build their own colonial structures. So we see a lot of destruction. We see a lot of destruction. So this is, again, not to romanticize our communities, but to say that the ideal of the Quechua community is intelligently designed with attention to the human position and responsibility in relation to Hanakpacha, Kaipacha, and Ohupacha. So there's intelligence behind the architecture. There's also a tremendous amount of intelligence matched with value systems in the way that community members live, and that is pragmatic as well as aesthetic. So pragmatically, you are not going to seek conflict with your neighbor. If you are living in an Ayu, you're going to try to find ways to avoid conflict, mediate conflict, resolve conflict, because people do dispute and disagree with things. But in the long term, the ideal is that Quechua communities, in terms of human to human interactions, do have systems of conflict resolution, because pragmatically speaking, you need each other to live in this place, especially if you are doing things such as building homes, working, farming together, contributing to community wellness together. Maybe the community needs the building of a new school, or it needs irrigation ditches dug, things like that. Then you have to work together, and you're going to see people around you. So there's an incredible pragmatism regarding human to human relationships within a community. There's also a really important spirit, I believe, of the generosity and kindness in the ideal of our Quechua Ayus and the ideal of our Quechua communities, which is the recognition that we're all here in this place, that we're all contributing. We've all been gifted life. So what does it mean to help each other? And within our communities, there are also specific protocols for how you ask for help and what you do when you receive that help. So these are places where living and IU systems of interaction are not haphazard. It's not like we sit in this community and think, oh, I really love the birds. Isn't that great? Or I really like my neighbor, but where in other places, you don't necessarily rely on them for your life and they don't rely on you for theirs. So in other places around the world, sometimes we find a lot of disconnection where you might appreciate more than human relationships. You might appreciate your human relatives or human neighbors, but you don't necessarily need them because you can go off and do your own things. But again, pragmatically speaking, in IU and communities, people are living in these places for generations. So they have found protocol-rich ways of continuing to engage with each other. And so when you think about your relationship to more than human kin, when you think about your relationship to human relatives, there's knowledge, there are skills that are associated with how you relate. And there's also philosophy. Every community member that you speak with is going to have some kind of philosophy regarding what it means to be in this place and to be among the many. As a researcher and as a university professor, I believe that there is such richness and such a need for us to ensure that all of the people that we care about, all of the communities that we love, all of these places where people are really working hard, doing their own things, not necessarily seeking the spotlight, that those stories have an opportunity to be told if they wish to be told. And in many ways, I am very interested in, and all of my work focuses on, ordinary people, because that's my family, that's my community. That's who I view myself as, but it's also who I strive to be. Because so much of what I think it means to be an Indigenous person in this time now, and being in the diaspora, for example, working at a US university, and that's just my case or my story, but for so many Indigenous peoples, I think it's critical for us to constantly research, constantly seek to understand, to constantly interrogate our own positionalities, and to constantly know that we are just one small part of a larger family of peoples, and a larger movement for the continuation of the thriving, and in some cases, the survival of our peoples today and increasingly into the future. All of the things that we believe, so the things that I described to you about the IU, the things that I described to you about our more than human relationships, have been so heavily under attack for the last 500 years through colonization. The violence that was sparked by that initial era in the 1500s is a pain. It is a heavy pain, and it is a grief and a trauma that our people still carry today. People still talk about this. They remember the stories, because they've been passed on generation to generation. And what we also may not remember, or what folks living in different parts of the world, and by we I mean as a society, as a human global society, what we may not remember, particularly for the case of Peru, is that these kinds of colonial injustices did not end with independence, Peruvian independence. And they certainly continued in terms of land usurpation, sexual and gender violence, gender-based violence, and exploitation of Quechua bodies for labor, a complete transformation and overhaul of the economic, political, and social systems that place Indigenous peoples, despite being, you know, a large part of the population, at the very bottom of the list. And so what I hope your work will do is to create some kind of a repository, a living snapshot of this moment, of what people believe they have come from, where they believe they are now, and what they hope for the future. And that this living snapshot can be utilized as a resource for other Quechua students in particular, like heavily other Quechua students, as well as, you know, heavy emphasis on community members who often hear of themselves being talked about in the media as victims, as caricatures, you know, as the economically the poorest, which is always equated with being intellectually and culturally poor as well, you know, and for community leaders as well to really think about what does it mean that that stories and some kind of understanding of who we are as Quechua peoples, it has entered you know, a place like the Library of Congress, which holds some stature as an institution, holds stature. So what does it mean that these things are made available and that they highlight our lives, you know, and the different journeys that our lives have taken over time? So I think it's a tremendously important project. It's a tremendously important undertaking as a snapshot in this time and place. What I think is really critical, and this is very specifically for us as Peruvians and for the case of Peru, is that we have to remember that we're only 20 years out from a very painful national conflict, you know, a very painful time where many, many people were killed. The estimates by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission are, you know, 70,000 approximately. I have seen reports where it's up to 100,000 people. And the majority of those people are Indigenous peoples, the majority of them, vast majority of them. And so we're coming out of a time where people, life, you know, not only people, but also their lands, their farms, their livestock, you know, their cows, their alpacas, their sheep, were obliterated by this conflict. You know, so we're coming out of that time. It's only been 20 years. And what does it mean that Indigenous lives can be so easily dismissed? So I do believe that your collection, your efforts to collect a story, and it doesn't have to be fancy, it doesn't have to be this lengthy oral history or some kind of a, you know, hugely funded research project, you know, or a project where somebody says it's significant because somebody else says that it matters. But rather, like, what does it mean for us to collect all of these stories of quote unquote ordinary people living their lives, doing their things, because those lives matter, because their stories matter. Of those people who were lost, they were people. Their animals, their more than human relatives mattered. They had stories. All of them had families who grieved for them. All of them had breath of life in them, you know, according to Quechua philosophy. We all have pacha. You know, pacha is our life force. It's our energy. You know, some people have translated that into God, right? But that's always translated into sort of the Judeo-Christian version of what is God. Well, if we translate that into God, then that means that we have God within us. Every being has God within them. You know, this is similar to some conceptualizations from Eastern religions. What does it mean when those things are cut short? What does it mean when those things are violently taken away? So what is the antithesis to that? What is the antithesis to the dismissal of the lives of Indigenous peoples? It is this kind of time. It is the collection of the stories. It is you talking to your grandparents, and maybe you record a 5-minute conversation on your iPhone, or whatever technology you're using, or you take notes. Maybe you talk to your grandmother and you write a poem on it, or maybe you talk to an auntie, or a cousin, and you develop some kind of a song, right? Or you paint something. Maybe you paint a portrait of, the family, the dog. Maybe your grandfather talks about a dog that he was very fond of, and you paint a portrait of this dog. That's what it means. That is the antithesis of the devaluation of Indigenous lives, is this kind of a thing, the micro interactions. This is how we do these things on a daily basis, is asking the questions of people's thoughts, what's in their hearts, what are they going to do for that day, what have they eaten. Nothing is minimal.